Good morning again. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off on this last slide. One of the last things I wanted to point out about this slide is that your book points out in the last bullet that a working class family's standard of living often depended on its number of workers. If that's true, if their standard of living depended on the number of workers, then is that also true for their mobility, economic mobility? So, should a family who has more contributing workers in it be able to have more economic mobility? And if not, then what is the relationship between standard of living and economic mobility? I'd like to pose that question to you for discussion. Okay, now that you've discussed that, I'd like to move on to the chart that's in your textbook that compares monthly budgets between two different individuals. That of a laborer, his wife, and one child in 1891, and a married banker with no children in 1892. So, what inferences, after examining this chart in your textbook, can you gain concerning not just the comparisons and contrasts between the two, but what inferences can you gain about American life during this period, about the choices of consumers, of a standard of living, education, and out of all of these factors, what is the most significant difference between the two in the quality of life between these two individuals and their families? So I'd like you to consider that for discussion. Okay. One thing I'd like to point out about this chart in your book, specifically, it's pretty straightforward. You can see that the majority of Americans are actually in the working class occupations. So I'd like you to consider this question. In a democracy that's driven by both political participation and representative government, when you consider that over half of the population in 1890 was made up of working class occupations, why was it, do you think, that there was no creation of a workers' party as a political party in the US political system during this period? And the reason why I'm asking that is that during the late 1800s, we see the growth of labor movements, not only in the United States, but also around the world. And in many of these cases, excuse me, labor movements also developed into their own political parties, but that didn't happen in the United States. So consider again the factors of both political participation and representative government. And then ask yourself, why was there no Labor Party created? Why do you think that the majority of Americans during this period relied on the two existing parties? And consider the factors that were developing within the late 19th century as well politically. And we're going to talk about that in the next chapter, but I'd like you to consider that as well. So when we take a look at the family economy, okay, it's important to consider a couple of factors. First, many children worked outside the home, and this was often more true from immigrant families than it was from native-born families. If child labor was closely linked to a father's income, I'd like you to consider the aspect from a social point of view, as well as a political and economic perspective, that of what is inherently wrong with child labor. We know that many individuals fought very hard to end child labor within the United States. But what are the values behind the arguments that oppose the employment of children outside the home as in many cases, as you'll see here in the text, as well as probably in many of our own personal families' histories, why employment is also prioritized over education, specifically during this period. My grandfather, for instance, got, I believe, about a fourth grade education. My grandmother finished high school, but neither of them went to college. Consider the arguments also in the changes for American women that you notice in the textbook here, as well as on this slide. Consider the argument now that for gradual versus radical abolition back before the Civil War period, and now relate it to the issues during this period of industrialization with women's rights and gender equality. So my question to you was gradual change enough in the improvement of economic conditions for women? Or should there have been a demand for full economic equality concerning gender in the late 1800s? And are the same arguments that could be used for gradual abolition of slavery the same ones that can be used for the gradual improvement in economic conditions for women versus the radical abolition theory of the immediate emancipation of slaves and compared to the immediate economic equality of women in the late 1800s? So take some time to discuss that topic, and then we'll continue on with the next slide. Okay, so your book points out that there's an increase in the number of women working in particular fields. So we see a gradual increase specifically in the fields of chemical, electrical, paper printing, food, and metal. What inferences can you determine from this particular chart concerning not just the number of women who are employed in particular fields, but the types of fields themselves? Okay. Now, your textbook goes on to discuss the rise of the labor movement. We're going to take some time to go over that here in this PowerPoint. So, your book goes on to say that fashioning their arguments from the Republican legacy, workers claim that the degradation of the country's citizen laborers threatened to undermine the Republic itself. Now, let's go over this statement in detail, okay? Notice that they do mention a Republican legacy, and that obviously infers that there is a triumph of union over Confederacy, okay? But there's also a claim here that citizens are being degraded. It's that the working conditions and the economic earnings are not equal. Notice also that this statement calls workers citizen laborers, and that they are political participants as well as wage-earning workers. Now, does that degradation threaten the Republic? So the essential question that I'd like you to consider for this topic is class conflict inherent in class division? So just because there's a division of classes, which, you know, there's traditionally been throughout the history of mankind, does that imply that, or inhere that there is class conflict? Think of the arguments made here by laborers. First, is degradation caused directly by capitalism? And then following that line of reasoning, if that is correct, did capitalism threaten the Republic? Now, we did discuss this on Tuesday when we broke up into different groups and took different topics to determine whether you strongly agreed or disagreed with them. I'd like you to return to that conversation right now by analyzing this statement. and then we'll go on to the next slide. Okay. Many jobs had workers who began to try and assert their economic independence. In that case, workers were trying to determine, if you notice in the statement here, the control of the workplace. And that's a very interesting expression. So, really, within that question is, do workers or employers have control of the workplace? Which group is the one that asserts their authority? And where exactly is authority derived in the workplace? Is authority driven by traditional hierarchical structures of organization, meaning that whoever is on top as a boss or a manager or a foreman has authority over the people below them? Or are the workers themselves so important to the production of goods and the determination of profit that they actually have control of the workplace? Or I'd like you to consider the other possibility. If it's true that workers don't have control of the workplace, is it a hopeless battle for them to try and assert through the organization of labor unions and the participation in strikes their right to try and control that workplace? Okay, those are some very deep questions. Feel free to rewind if you want, and we'll continue with the next slide. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the strikes themselves. So, your book points out some important facts here, and that is that the most direct method to adjust the working conditions was the strike. It's important to note that there are many other tactics used by unions during this period. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into class. But your book points out that even though unions developed earlier than 1876, it was the 1877 railroads workers' strike that shocked the nation. And in it, tens of thousands of people went on strike, and more than 100 people were killed by federal troops. And that in itself raises very interesting questions. Okay, first, why is 1876 or 1877 important? We know that Reconstruction ended with the political election of the Republican Haynes over the Democrat Tilden, and all Union troops left the South. We know that the country was trying to return to a sense of pre-war growth after the massive destruction of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. But consider here, what is the real battle? Okay, even though your book points out that 6 million workers and 36,757 strikes broke out between 1881 and 1905, is it a struggle between the workers against the employers themselves, or a struggle of workers against the government? And I'd like you to consider the defenders of employers. In this case, many employers made the argument that unions and their operations of strikes were illegal, and many courts had issued injunctions against them. If it's true that strikes were illegal, then businesses relied on the federal government in order to enforce the law. But is it really a question of law, or are there deeper issues here in the tactics used by unions against their employers in order to improve their working and living conditions? And if that's true, what is the real responsibility of government concerning its citizens, especially its citizens' workers? We'll talk a little bit more about other information in the next PowerPoint.